Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our second episode of Heroscape Army Deep Dives. I'm Josh from Rangers of the East, and today I'm very happy to be going over the guard unit synergies, especially because this is a very interesting, niche kind of synergy web. It's not what you usually see in competitive environments. However, Heroscape is a game that can be played in more than just that one format, and one of the goals of this channel is to promote those lesser used synergies and playstyles. So I'm very happy to be sharing this video with you all today. Now, it has been some time since I last uploaded. I think 6 months, in fact, have gone by. What can I say? Life gets in the way sometimes, but I'm back. I have multiple channel ideas and scripts in the pipeline right now, so you can expect some pretty frequent uploads. I'm gonna go for once a week for now, and we're gonna see what happens in that regard. So, with that being said, I'm just happy to be back, and let's dive right in. So, the overview for the Guard Army is pretty simple. It's basically restricted to whether you're going to use the Warden 816 in your army. Now, Guard synergies in this context refers to any army card that has the Guard personality on it. So this includes units such as the Warden 816, Martin the Grub, Yeti and Guards, the new upcoming Veteran Honor Guard with Age of Annihilation. Right, all of these units share one keyword in common, which is Guard. Now, the Guard keyword itself, if we think about what it means in terms of the game, these are units that act more as objective grabbers or as defendable units, right? They can hold an objective pretty well, or they can defend an enemy that they synergize with pretty well, although there's not too many direct synergies with guards. Really, you're only going to see that with the new Age of Annihilation units, which is the Veteran Honor Guard, and the unit that is rather similar to them and perhaps was an inspiration, which is the Martin the Grubs. For the most part, a lot of these units lack normal synergies, and so you have a very slight buff by including the Warden. Now, that entails the idea that you do not need to have a guard synergy list in order to get use out of the guard's figures. Now, what is this guard synergy? It simply has to do with the Warden 816 miniature, which was, I believe, released in Wave 8 in the original Heroscape release, who provides a +1 movement buff to any unit in your army with a guard personality. Now, +1 move usually isn't too great on its own. Remember that scouts, when referring to the scout units in the game, their bonder, being Mittens, or the V-neck Warlord, gives all of the scouts a +2 move and increases moves from like moves of around 7 for a lot of scouts all the way up to like move 9 with a +2. The Warden only increases the move by 1, but while that could be thought of as a pretty like low advantage compared to what the V-neck Warlord does, you have to remember this in the terms of what guard units usually do. They're slow moving, not very maneuverable units that only have a movement range of usually 4 to 5 spaces. So, in that context, +1 move is actually very efficient for them. It's a very great buff because it still increases the movement by around 20-25%, which is the same thing that you see with the V-neck Warlord with his scout buff benefiting units that are usually in the 6 to 7 move range. Still, with the Warden being around 90 points in the standard scape, this build is not that great on its own, because it relies on a 90-point figure that just provides a single movement buff to figures with that personality in your army. There's no range, so you don't need to move them up. However, there's not a lot of bonding options with them. There's none in Classic Scape, or so far with the Renegade version of Heroscape either. So you're really dealing with a unit that's going to kind of stay in the deployment zone until it's used for cleanup or whatever other use you have for the army that you're building. Right, you're not able to move him and your squad at the same time. So, because of that nature, the build is technically less competitively viable when compared to units that have bonding units or the classic idea of preferring squads over heroes for the multiple attacks a turn. And while we'll get to the Warden in a moment, and he has a couple of interesting tricks up his sleeve, this is not usually seen as competitive as other builds. However, remember that the Heroscape itself is not supposed to be designed to be tailor-made just for competitive format play, where you have you go to a tournament with a certain set of maps that are all competitively balanced. A lot of the time, the expectation for Heroscape is you sit down, build a map with people, and draft up your armies. And so if, when people are drafting or with the map design, one of these units in the guard synergy web stands out as a potential good unit to use, it's a perfectly acceptable and perfect time to use such a figure. So, with that being said, and with that caveat out of the way, let's go ahead and take a look into the centerpiece for your guard synergy list, which is going to be the Warden himself. Now, this figure is a 2 life, 6 defense figure with a range of 7, which is pretty good, and then attack of 3 and defensive 6, which I mentioned already. Now, this makes him kind of similar to a Yetian guard, almost similar to the 2 Yetian guards that come together in one squad, but you always get that attack of 3, and your defense is 1 dice lower, so if you get hit with a splash of damage that you have to take multiple wounds on, he's out of the game, compared to with a Yetian. You lose 1 Yeti and you have 1 left over. Now, he's a small figure. He does have a tricky personality, so Ozonashi and I believe Agent Skyen, a couple tricky figures that have a slight bond with him. He is a Silborg, but it's an Utkar Silborg, so that limits his synergy web with the Silborgs. And his main other ability is that he does have a eviscerate special attack, which can only be used on figures equal to or at a larger height than him, which does give you a pretty decent attack of 5. However, you would only use this if the Warden found himself being engaged by another unit, because you probably are not going to be running this guy up, especially at his movement of 5. Notice how his guard leadership does not buff his own movement, so you're going to be kind of stuck with that movement of 5. So I would call this figure a pretty good cleanup figure, because as we have already discussed, he's not able to actually bond with any units in the game, with the exception of Ornak, who can bond with 2 Utkar heroes for the first order marker, to have 2 heroes move in your first turn. But if you're going to do so, you might as well either make sure that you have another hero that you would really get some good use out of, and activating a second hero with Ornak, and or you're doing some kind of Grat-leaning build. Because remember again that the Warden does not necessarily force you into a guard exclusive synergy. So as we'll go over later with an example army comp, you can have a secondary army idea, in this case being like Grats, Blade Grats, or not Blue Grats, that's VC, or Heavy Grats, right? Bonding with Ornak, which also will bond with the Warden and go into your guard synergies. So, going over pricing, as you can see, I'm going to have, for each unit that we discussed, I'm going to have the Renegade pricing, the standard, and that's what I'm going to use for designing armies and whatnot. However, since many people use Delta, I also include the current Delta price. Note that that is subject to change as time goes on. Also note that Delta prices, on top of being an alternative points format, can also tell you a bit about what the unit's competitive viability is. So if a unit's Delta cost is a lot lower than its standard Heroscape cost, you can use that to be an indicator for the unit not performing as well as you would expect for its original points total. So if you have a large points downgrade, that perhaps means that it's a less competitive unit. Alright, so let's go ahead and go into some of the good pairs for the Warden. The first one is going to be Blastotrons, of course. Your Blastotrons are guards that have a movement of 5 already, and moving them up to a movement of 6 is a pretty good bump up for them. Now, there's 2 ways that you can use the Blastotrons here. The standard way, of course, is in a Blastotron Gladiatron build, where you run 2 or so units of Blastotrons, 2 or 3 units of Gladiatrons, right? And in this combination, you can add the Warden in to make your Blastotrons a bit more mobile. This might help with when you're trying to rush all your Blastotrons out and keep them from being left behind by the Gladiatrons as they rush on ahead. Remember too, though, that since the Gladiatrons do not have a movement buff, then the Blastotrons have a bit of a movement advantage in that regard. So the Warden may not be as much of a good use for these builds. However, if the Blastotrons are a piece in your army with other stuff complementing them, the Warden in that case could be a good fit. Of course, you also don't have to use Gladiatrons, even though the card gives you a bonus for moving a bunch of Gladiatrons up for tying down your opponents, as the units can also function pretty well with Major X17 or the upcoming Major Q11, as these are also Viadar Soulborgs that can get engaged in melee and are expected to be engaged in melee, that the Blastotrons can then use in order to gain attack buffs, right? Because their one attack is not going to do that much, but if you get that up on height and with a one of your majors attacking an opponent's figure, and then also in this case you'll have to be more competitive and more aggressive with your Blastotrons. And in this case the movement buff is really good because being able to move up further can more easily allow you to get more of your Blastotrons up. So again, notice though that this homing device is only for Viadar Soulborgs. So if there's one piece in the army that won't be used, it's the Warden, because he is an Ugar Soulborg, and he's going to do nothing for these Blastotrons besides the passive movement buff. So they're costed at 60 points in the Renegade Scape, and 70 points in Delta, because the Gladiatron build is really good. So I'm going to go ahead and show some of those Blastotron synergy units, just so you can take a look at and get an idea for yourself. I won't necessarily go over these units anymore, but if you have any inspirations from here, now's the time to kind of take a little look, especially if you haven't taken a good look at Major Q11 yet. He definitely is a very interesting figure. So the next unit that would be a good pair with the Warden is the Martin the Grubs. Now, these units already have a movement of 6, so moving them up to a movement of 7 does pretty well for them, but not as much as other units can benefit, right? You're only adding about 16% to the movement value. So still though, these Grubs can act as a very cheap, speedy glyph grabber for your army. Now, of course, they're used in Maro abilities for the most part because of their ability to bond with Tolkolna, Warsaga, and the upcoming Thyraxis Dragoon, being Hive Lords. But in 2 of these cases, they don't really need to have that much of a movement buff to really gain much of at all value out of them. Remember though, keep in mind that you're probably going to have multiple squads of these Grubs, so in order for them to properly keep up with your Hive Lord, as long as you're moving more than just your initial 3 Grubs, you're going to have them moving fast at a faster pace than your Maro hero, or the Thyraxis Dragoon hero, right? In order to make sure that you have enough Grubs next to that hero to help prevent some wounds from being taken onto them. So for Tolkolna and Warsaga and the Thyraxis Dragoon, the extra movement is nice, but since it matches their Hive Lord's own movement, it's not necessarily helping you too much. But the exception to this, I would say, is Subakna, because Subakna, while he does have a movement of 6, he also has flying. So he's moving over height, he's moving over obstacles, he's able to get a lot further into the board than his other Hive Lord counterparts can. And because of this, it is really good for the Grubs then to have a bit of a movement buff so that they can move further into the board and try to better keep up with Subakna. Because the last thing you're going to want to have is for Subakna to be deployed too far out, right? You overcommit him, and then your Grubs can't catch up, and then he takes a bunch of wounds, he gets taken out. Now, an argument could be made that Subakna is a less aggressive unit, especially because he provides a small buff, but that one added to the Odai rule for any Maro abilities is not gonna be usually a game changer. So in order to keep Subakna more confident in being able to be aggressive and use his high attack value on targets, increasing the movement value here could help them a lot. So in the classic Heroscape and Renegade Scape, the Grubs here with 30 points, and then they're pushed up to 35 in Delta, because they are rather useful figures. My next pick for good pairs with the Warden are the Granite Guardians. Now, this is a squad that probably doesn't get talked about too much, especially because they're very expensive to own. They came out in Wave 10, which was the last wave of like classic Heroscape before the D&D license took over the brand. And as such, they're very expensive figures now. You're looking for between $80 to $100 to get a squad of them, and you're probably going to want a couple of squads because they're common squads. Now, it is worth noting, and I'll get to this later when we get to the Obsidian Guards, another guard unit, that the Obsidian Guards were repainted here to be the Granite Guardians. So, especially knowing that now Heroscape has units that are coming in unpainted and you have to paint them yourself, and having different color variations on units is going to be less looked down upon now. You could just buy a couple of units of Obsidian Guards and either repaint them yourself, or in that case you could just print them, or just use your Obsidian Guards and say that they are just like molten Granite Guardians. So, looking at the stats for the Granite Guardians, this is a squad that can be immensely helped by the extra movement provided by the Warden. Right, their base movement is only at 3, which is very slow. This is helped by the gain high ground special rule. After taking a turn with the Guardians, for every Guardian you control, you can move it up a space if it's adjusted to height. So, of course, the idea is that you put as many Granite Guardians as you can in your deployment zone or at the end of any turn on a spot next to height, and whenever you do that extra movement from gain high ground, you move one to a space that's next to another height space. So, in a way, these units are at least move 5 as you can get them up to height, right? Because they're always going to be climbing. And so adding an extra movement onto that does a huge amount of work for them, especially in turns that they couldn't get to that height beforehand. Because the difference between moving 3 spaces and then moving 4 being next to height and moving 6 or 7, that is the difference between 3 and 7-ish spaces to move your model up, which is huge. Additionally, while they only have 1 life because it's a common squad in classic Escape, they have a defense of 5, and since they're so apt at moving up on higher ground, they're probably going to have a defense of 6 most of the time, which is really good. They have 2 other special abilities too, where if they're on height, then they can add 2 to its range. So they can have a 3 range rock throw special attack, which is going to have height advantage inherently, so it's going to be a 4 dice attack, which can be buffed by any glyphs or if you happen to have tailored in the list, right? And then Landslide gives them an even larger advantage on the height advantage against adjacent figures, where they add another dice to the attack. So it goes, when they're adjacent to another figure and they're on a height, they roll 5 attack dice. So these figures need to get on height, and so this is a squad that can be immensely helped by getting that movement bonus. Especially because these figures don't have any natural bonders on their own, so you don't have to worry about losing out on many options if you're including them in your list in terms of bonders. So of all the units I'm showing today, this is probably the squad that could benefit the most from having the Warden in their army. Now in Heroscape, usual points, they were valued on 100 points, Delta values them at 75. Next up is a new unit that is going to be released in early 2025. The Festering Honor Guard. This is one of the new scored hour units that have been, at this time, just reviewed by Renegade. And so they haven't been playtested extensively by the community yet. We've had some of these cards beforehand, but they're going to receive their extensive play now through and especially whenever the units come out. So this is another squad that works pretty well as a unit of cheap objective grabbers that have a base remove of 6, and so increasing that move to 7 is pretty decent. It's also a 5-man squad, which is really good, especially for getting that extra movement value out of them, because it multiplied by all 5 members of the squad, especially at the start of the game when you have all 5 of them still left, you're gaining an extra total 5 spaces of movement, which is pretty good for a unit with a movement buff. This is also a squad that you would definitely consider moving up early and not being worried about if they get too far engaged and die off, because in a sense you almost want these figures to die, because their main benefit comes from the Parasite. And then if Parasite doesn't go off correctly and your queen dies too fast, the surviving honor guards do allow you to maintain some of your order marker advantage by moving it onto their cards and allowing them to take some extra turns with an slightly increased attack value. So In this case as well, the movement buff can help you a lot, because if you have a couple of festering honor guard that are in a bad position, you're not expecting your queen to die and then she dies, you can rapidly reposition these guys to help to try to reform your line. So it's a very interesting unit in that regard, especially if it has that +1 buff to its movement, even if that is not by itself a very large addition. So with its activation synergies and the increased movement buff from an already high movement, you can get a squad of 5 Festering Honor Guard moving pretty rapidly across the board. Also, this is another unit that is very small, so they can be hidden pretty well in the terrain of the game. So you can probably use this extra movement to help get them in places that are tough for your opponent to be able to target them from. As the figures have not been officially released yet, Delta has not adjusted the points, and so for every format, they're worth 60. Now that we've gone over what I've identified as some of like the really good picks, or decent picks because the guard list by itself is inherently not too competitive, let's go into some of the less viable units that are still good filler. The first of these is the Yetian Guards. Now, the Yetian Guards are an iconic piece of the original Heroscape that any veteran player definitely has a lot of memories of, especially given the original small pool that Rise of the Valkyrie offered. This is a slightly controversial squad, because many people who originally played them didn't seem to get a lot of viability out of them. It's a 2-man squad with 2 attacks, and only if both of your figures are alive do you get an additional attack dice on the second figure if they target the same figure. So there's a lot of caveat and not too much reward to be gained. However, they do have a pretty respectable defense, 7 dice. And since they are guards, and they're designed very similarly to the Warden at that, they synergize pretty decently with the Warden. Now, the movement from increase from going from 4 to 5, as we've discussed, is pretty massive. This allows the guard to be able to better go up on a height as they move without being stuck immediately, and enables them to do a lot more movement tactics that by themselves they wouldn't be able to actually get away with. So this can help them better get into a position that can allow them to actually gain the height that they need to get decent attack potential out of them. And so because of that, the Warden actually helps them pretty well. Of course, they are a squad that does not have any kind of bonders in classic Heroscape, so they do suffer from that. But if you're not directly looking for bonding units, they could be a good filler option for the last 70 points in your army. Or, if you're in Delta, only 55. The other thing to note about these figures is that, especially since they are more mobile now with the Warden, these now act as very good objective claimers. In this regard, they obey their guard class extremely well, as you can place one onto a glyph or onto an objective, and with 7 or 8 defense dice, first of all, you were able to get them there in the first place with the buff's move, and second of all, they're going to take a lot to get these guys to go down. And even before they do go down, if you see a threat coming up on you, you do have a chance to take a turn with them and get a bit of damage onto those enemy figures before they get too close. The range of 7 is also very good at creating a large threat range around where they're standing at, and that threat range goes up to 12 spaces, of course, with that movement buff. So, good, decent filler figures if you're running an army in this regard and have some extra points to spare. Now, next up is the Drow Chain Fighter. This is a pretty good filler unit for getting to a point limit if you want to take advantage of the Warden's extra movement buff. Right, for 25 points or 20 in Delta, you're getting a figure that, with the Warden, is going to move 7 spaces, has a decent attack and defense, and while it only has 1 life, it does have a couple of tricks up its sleeve with Chain Grab, and then a Hide in Darkness, which, although you may not be playing with a Shadow Space usually nowadays, it still could be decent. Now, the only problem with the Chain Fighter is how he fits into how the Warden already operates. See, if the Warden is already a sort of cleanup figure in your army, it's going to make it difficult to want to use the Drow Chain Fighter, because if you ought to keep him for cleanup, and he is one of, if not the last figure to be used in your game, then the Warden will possibly already be gone by the time you use him, negating the point of bringing in the Drow Chain Fighter instead of some other units at all. So a better strategy with him would be to, whenever you can see an opening, to place an order marker on him at a conveniently good and strategic time, so that you can bring him out, try to chain grab a opponent's unit that is worth doing a chain grab for to get them out of position, so that you can then target them with other units. Alright, so now onto the bad takes. And guard units have a lot of bad takes. We'll have to get through these, and you'll see why in a moment. The first one, I went ahead and put Guri Oni in the bad takes. He's not a terrible figure, but he has no bonding. 4 life, 4 defense, goes down faster than you think it will. And while he does have an attack of 4, he only moves 5 spaces. This is slightly helped by the increase in movement up to 6. And Evil Eye Defense does help you if you roll more defense dice, but by himself he's probably not going to be rolling too many more defense dice than your opponent is going to be rolling attack dice. That is, shields for skulls. Your Evil Eye Defense will rarely actually give you any benefit. Tetsubo Special Attack is interesting, but really it's just a 1 3-dice attack that affects 2 different figures, and again, they have to be adjacent to you. So 190 points just to get that movement buff isn't too great. If you have the figure, it might be fun to use him just for the flex value of having an Akia's Alliance figure in your collection. But 190 points is a lot to invest in one figure that just has 6 move, doesn't bond, and doesn't give any other benefit to your army. Next up is the Obsidian Guards. If you're playing on a lava map, they're not terrible, because usually lava maps designed nowadays place the lava on height. So if you can get your guards up to height, which they can possibly be able to do if they're with the Warden already, which gives them their movement buff, then you could consider going ahead and doing this. Right, you would choose what's probably the closest piece of lava terrain to your board, place the Obsidian Guards on that piece of height with the help of the Warden's movement buff, and then sit them there and allow them to throw lava and do what the Granite Guardians do, but with +1 attack. Now, for the most part, they're just a worse version of the Granites, which already aren't too great of a unit. You can see this by the Granite Guardians, as we discussed previously, being defined at 75 points in Delta, whereas the Obsidian Guards, for the same standard price of 100 points, are worth about 60. Now, the best use case then for the Obsidian Guard is if you're playing on a lava map and you're playing Delta, and you have it set up right with a Warden and possibly Raylan and other figures to help give them height and defense buffs, because then you could be looking at some pretty decent stats on these guards, throwing out quite a lot of attacks. But normally, unless you're playing on lava, which most people aren't going to have until they get released here in a few months, use them as proxies for the Granite Guardians. Probably your best bet. The most enlightening figure of the bunch. The cornerstone of the guard unit type, and the reason why the guard class is as looked down upon as it is. The Dumatev guard is not a good figure. 1 life, 4 attack, 4 defense. You have to use an entire order marker on him to run him up, hope to get him on a road tile, just for him to then, in the next turn, run up, or get, if he's not shot immediately, run up and deal very little damage, and then die. Now, if you have a bunch of Devourers and you're playing on a road map, sure, maybe they can do something. But even if you had a use for this guy, the Warden's not going to help him, because the whole point of him is to move on to all road space. And unless there is a specific difference between 6 movement and 7 movement to get on that road tile, you're probably not going to use him anyways. And even if you did, once he gets on the road, it's just a straight shot, adding +3 to his movement, so he's already very speedy as is. So maybe, but he's not very good. He's 15 points in Delta. He is a filler, maybe. Now, you want to get some real benefits out of the guards? Dip in a VC. In VC, there are so many options to help the guards out. All of the units on the right are either guards themselves, or in the case of the Death Commander, do so much to help the guards actually activate with one another and to get synergies within them. So, the Death Commander, if the Death Commander is engaged, then you can take another turn. You can take a turn with the Warden that gives you a bonding synergy with him, as well as with other units that might be guards and snowboards, like the Zedian guards, and then also the Zedian infantry, which themselves also have an Ukar bonding if you're with any Ukar snowboard, which is the Warden, and things like the Death Commander and whatnot. In fact, you can get a pretty nice actually chain of bonding by going back and forth between the Zedian infantry and the Death Commander, right? So there's a lot of options there. You also have the Honor Guard, which act as guard. There are guard figures, which are pretty interesting on their own because they already have a movement buff with themselves, right? You can, at the end of the round, you can move 6 of them 2 spaces each. But if you've played this list before, you probably know that you still have a bit of difficulty getting some of these Honor Guard up fast enough. And so the Warden can be a great help with that, of helping those Honor Guard move up the board at the rate that you want them to. And lastly, Tomb Skeletons, and then while they couldn't fit here, the Tomb Skeleton Archers are also 2 squads that are in dire need of a movement buff, where they're both guard units. They have a movement of 4, and so that moving up to a movement of 5 is incredible for them. It allows you to actually potentially get use out of their flanking form. So these are most of the options here that you have access to in VC. So if you're interested in going into the quote-unquote official customs landscape in Heroscape, this is an avenue where playing a guard kind of army can actually be very rewarding for you. With that out of the way though, let's move back into the classics in Renegade Heroscape. Let's go over a couple of sample army lists that you can use these guard heroes for. The first one I have is a Warden and Gretz build. Both of these armies I'm going to show off today are going to be 500-point armies, given the standard points. So if you're interested, you can adjust them down for what they would be in Delta, or really the important part here is to take what's here and think about yourself, what you want to have your army do, and think about how you can change bits and pieces of these in order to suit your own needs or your own playstyles. So my idea with this army is that you're trying to get some actual use out of the Warden before the endgame, right? Because the Warden doesn't have any bonding synergy on his own. So using Ornak allows you to activate him, as well as Tornak with the Blade Gruts, so that you can get 2 different fronts, if you will, moving at the same time. So after this, Tornak, of course, then is going to bond with your Blade Gruts. But remember, Ornak does as well. So once you've moved Tornak up in your first round, don't be afraid to go ahead and move Ornak up with your Blade Gruts, in order to guarantee that all your common figures aren't going to get targeted as easily. The last thing that you want to have is to have a bunch of heroes who can synergize with one another, but no more common figures to actually give you attacks. So Ornak is a surprisingly survivable piece that, moving up with the rest of your army, acts as another threat piece for your opponent to have to balance between. So on the other hand, of course, we have the 2 squads of Blastatrons that go with the Warden. Now, since the Blastatrons don't have any Gladiatrons to go with them, they're going to have to be a bit more aggressive. So you're going to want to make sure that you get these figures on height whenever you can, which shouldn't be as much of a problem because they are already given a movement buff. And since you have the Warden who will probably be moving with or near them, the Warden will act as another piece to hopefully take some of the fire off of your Blastatrons, so that you can get enough of them engaged in order to actually get some extra attack dice with each of their attacks. So if you're doing getting engaged with these Blastatrons, then you want to make sure that you focus your enemy down so you don't lose the squads. Really, the heroes are there to supplement your force, right, to give you some extra synergies and to make sure that your Blastatrons move out the board and to make sure that your orcs have a bit of support. But hopefully the star of the show is going to be your actual squads. So, as I said before, don't be afraid to move Ornak with the Blade Grutz, so you can get all your heroes moved up, and so you can have an army that's pretty cohesively moving up the board. The last thing to note with this army is that you do have to consider and try to strategize your angle of attack depending on the map, depending on your opponent's force, because the Blastotrons give you the ability to shoot relatively early on in the game. So if there's an all melee army coming up to you, you can, if you wanted to pod up more, and then whenever your Blastotrons start getting engaged, send in your Blade Grutz, send in your other Blastotrons, and try to, en masse, take down your enemy. Sometimes it might be better to just go out with your Blade Grutz at the start of the game, take out some high value targets, or take some objectives, and then move in with your Blastotrons after to help with cleanup. So there's a lot of strategy involved, and if you want a good test of your strategic skills, this could be an interesting army for you. The next army is what I call the Rocks for Jocks build. Anyone who has been to university before might be familiar with this vernacular, especially if you've been to an engineering college or basically any school that has some difficult courses. Rocks for Jocks in this case is a term for a course that is a lot easier than alternatives that you could take, right? So for example, if your school offers physics as a course that you can take for your degree, but also you can fill that requirement up with something a lot easier than physics, arguably, like environmental science and whatnot, right? You might label that as a Rocks for Jocks kind of class. It's easier, gives you the same credit, and who cares? So, but in this build, instead of doing science, you're moving a lot of rocks around the board. So, a bit more of a literal interpretation. The aim for this army, as you can probably see by Raylan, Granite Guardian, Zetic Guardian, is that you're maximizing the defense of your models to keep them alive for as long as possible. The goal then for this army is to have your Granites move up onto height as fast as possible, move Raylan up with them to help support, have your Zedians move up whenever needed to provide a range support, because once these Granite Guardians get on height, you're not going to want to move them at all, because it's only a disadvantage if you move them off of height. So in this regard, the Warden and the Zedians act as two pretty reliable ranged units to help take out opponents' squads or heroes that try to engage in a shootout with you. And then whenever your opponent does get close, the Granite Guardians can hopefully hold their own for a while and use their range 3 attacks, and that's especially as well as their main melee attack, to get a lot of damage onto your opponent. So hopefully, in the effort of trying to kill you, your opponent basically dies in the result. Kind of like Counter-Strike, but it's you doing it yourself. But yeah, so besides Raylan, as long as her aura is around your other units, you have about 8 defense dice for each unit in your army. So it makes it very difficult for your opponent to actually crack your shell. Be warned though that one extra attack dice on any of these figures, except for the Warden himself, is going to be enough to take one of these figures down. So while you do have a lot of defense, certain abilities that negate defense or just unlucky dice rolls will eventually happen. So your units aren't immune, but they're pretty reliable. So in this case, the Warden should only be used to clean up or if you need that extra bit of range, because you only get that one attack, and even though he has the melee buff of going up to 5 attack dice, which can't be modified because it's a special attack, the Granite Guardians will already be able to do that in melee anyways, and you have 6 of them at the start of the game. So really, the Warden should not be touched until you get to a point where your army is starting to break. Of course, if you're playing on a lava map, sure, you can argue to replace the Granite Guardians with Obsidian Guards, because the height is probably going to be lava, and in this case, the Obsidian Guards can handle that better and still get the same attack output. So, okay, there's an Obsidian Guard use. So, for some final thoughts that I have, the Guard build is rather niche, but there are some synergies that are still present. If you can open your mind out of the A+ strategies and synergies in Heroscape, there are a lot of squads and units in the game that can be very good and very fun to play. And so the guard, I argue here, is one of those kinds of units, where not only do they have some interesting synergies within themselves, with the additional movement buffs granted, but they can also act as a nice complement to the rest of the force, right, in the Grut board build, where you still have units of Gruts, but then you also have some pretty fast moving Blastotrons to go with them to help give them the range that the army usually lacks. Now, as Renegade continues to release their own units for the game, potentially new guard synergies will emerge and develop. And also for guard adjacent units, such as the Blastotrons and the Grubs, with bonding with Killborgs and Hive Lords, you can see more units that, even if they're not guards themselves, that could help this build in those regards. So, builds typically aren't that strong unless they include another quote-unquote win piece, right? As you can see in the Rocks for Jock's build, of course, that win piece is Raylan, and in the Orc build, that's going to be having a reliance on your Blade Gruts, which can be pretty effective and give you a lot of attacks in a turn. That can hide some of the weaknesses that the guard units usually have. Because if there's one thing you should remember about the guards, this should be a good supplement or objective piece that can help other pieces in your army more reliably do their job. So, that's all I have for the guard synergies. If you can please let me know in the comments of if there's any game that you've played with, especially the Warden or with any of the guard units in general, and how you feel about the playstyle and how much that the guard class means to you when using the unit. Please let me know any thoughts you have, any build ideas you have, any synergies I might have missed out on, or just good compliments that the updating guards and other guard units, right, have with other squads and heroes in the game. And be sure to like and share this video if you enjoyed it. And yeah, until next time, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you again. Goodbye.